I've been going to this camp since I was 6. Once I'd aged out, I returned as a junior counselor. Now, I'm finally a senior counselor, and I've been one for about 5 years already. In all my years at camp, I've had my fair share of laughs and screams, and gotten myself in and out of more trouble than I can even recall. Now, it was my turn to tell the legends and lore of the camp and terrify new generations of campers. The only downer, though, is that with the technological boom of late Gen Z, these kids don't scare as easily as we used to. They've seen much worse on the internet, and tales of headless axe murderers and tomato farmer serial killers barely even merit a sweaty brow. In my years as a counselor and as a camper, I've seen a lot. I don't tend to scare easily, though. Being responsible for a bunch of little kids, not to mention your rowdy trouble magnet friends at times, will give you that false sense of bravado in times of uncertainty and fear. Except, what do you do when the thing you're supposed to be watching over and protecting turns out to be your biggest threat? This is where I have to bring up Molly. I'll call her Molly for privacy's sake. She seemed like a normal kid outwardly, with unruly golden ringlet curls, a button nose, and pale, gray eyes. But there was something about her. Whether it be the dark glint in her eye, or the stiff way she carried herself, I cannot be entirely sure. All I know is that I have never seen a child command her parents on where to set up her bunk and how to set it up. Between her haggard mother and father's faces, and her cool, composed expression, it was evident who was in control here. I watched them unload their car quickly as she stood on the porch, clutching a book to her chest, expressionless. I went over to her and squatted beside her, smiling. I regarded my clipboard with the name of the girls in the cabin. "You must be Molly," I exclaimed. "It's nice to meet you. Is this your first time going to camp?" Silence. Her lack of a response took me aback. Just as I was about to open my mouth to speak again, her father stomped up the stairs with the last of her luggage. He shot her a look I couldn't quite decipher, and they slunk inside. As the rest of the parents unloaded their cars, my eyes fell upon Molly's mother, standing pinned straight in front of the passenger door of their beaten Volkswagen. I waved at her as enthusiastically as I could, trying to shut the rejection I had just faced out of my mind. She slowly raised her limp hand in a half wave, her blank expression ever the same. She also seemed a bit slack-jawed. I let my hand fall loosely at my side as she slowly let hers fall back down to hers. Her movements were jerky and unnatural. It was unsettling. Never breaking eye contact, I made my way back inside to help the rest of the kids unpack. Admittedly, the first few days were fairly normal. The first couple of nights, I had to sleep on a mattress on the floor of the kids' bunk room because they were either scared or they missed their moms, and begged me to stay with them. I was well acquainted with the floor at this point, because this typically happened every year with the newest campers. By night 3, I was ready to bring up my returning to the counselor's room. They were big girls now, going away to camp, and they needed to be brave. And of course, they could find me in the next room over if they ever needed me. A few girls were wary, but most had gotten used to cabin life, and were okay with finally toughing it out. By that night, I was back in my normal room with my junior counselor. Leaving the girls unattended was my first major mistake. It was the Thursday of the first week of camp when things began to happen. I was jolted from sleep by ear-splitting shrieks from the room next door. I practically flew from my top bunk with my junior counselor in tow as we beelined it for the girls' room. I burst through the door and found them cowering all together in a circle on the floor, holding each other and crying. Some were too scared to even move or breathe. "What's going on here, girls?" I cried. "Why were you screaming? What happened?" Between blubbering sobs, one of the girls pointed at the back window where Molly was standing. Molly scared us. She was scratching at the window from outside. I cocked my eyebrow at the dark, unmoving little figure at the back of the room. The red glow of the exit sign seemed to illuminate her eyes. I squinted at her frail silhouette. She was definitely still inside. There was no back door, no porch, and the cabin was held up by cement blocks. It would have been impossible for her to be peering in from the back window. "I only told them a little story," came a meek voice from the shadowy mass. "What story?" I demanded. The story of the 3 headless nuns. I froze. No way. No fucking way. That was the scariest camp story we had. We didn't tell that story to campers until they were at least 10. And who the hell had told her? I pushed the wave of questions out of my mind. I spent the next few hours telling the girls that the story wasn't real. Molly sat quietly in her bunk, watching soberly as the other traumatized 6-year-olds sobbed in their beds. I desperately tried to comfort them, but in the end, I dragged my mattress and sleeping bag back to my original spot on the floor. From then on, the girls couldn't sleep unless the windows were all securely covered, and they absolutely despised Molly. I'm talking full-on shunning and exclusion. I used every counselor trick I had up my sleeve to try and make things better, and to reconcile the girls, but none of them were having any of it. Molly was especially disinterested in the others, choosing instead to read her copies of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark over and over again. Over the course of the following weeks, Molly's behavior became increasingly sinister. She hid crickets and spiders in the girls' beds. She threw their toothbrushes in the unflushed toilets. She threw their clothes into the bushes and trees as it rained. She would hide under their bunks and make ungodly noises to scare them at night. She'd jump on top of them in the lake and pin them down until I sprinted over and pulled her off. She even slipped peanuts into one of the girls' bags of trail mix, the same girl who was deathly allergic to peanuts. After the peanut incident, the camp administrators and I decided that enough was enough. She was going to kill someone at this rate. I got onto the phone myself and let her parents have it. I recited the ever-growing list of offenses Molly had committed against my other campers and ultimately delivered the news that she was no longer welcome at camp. There was a long pause on the other end before Molly's mother monotonously agreed to come pick her up in the morning. I sighed and looked at the head counselor, who sat beside me. He groaned and nodded. One more night, and then she'd be out of my hair. I wasn't fully confident that my girls would make it through the night alive if I left them alone with Molly, so I again slept on their floor. I'd spent more nights on that floor than in the counselor's room, but what choice did I have? I was awoken by a soft, skittering noise. My eyes burst open, and I stared up at the ceiling, unmoving. A raccoon? No, bigger. It didn't sound far away enough to be on the porch. My stomach lurched at the realization that whatever was making the skittering noise was inside the room with us. I sat up and took a look around. The girls were all in their beds, at least the girls in the bottom bunks who I could see were. From the ground, I obviously couldn't tell about the top bunks, but these bunk beds were obnoxiously creaky, and I would have noticed if one of them had even moved. I propped myself on my elbow and listened some more. Silence. Sighing deeply, I lay back down on my stomach and flopped onto my pillow. I breathed heavily, watching the back windows nervously. I still can't fully come to terms with the events which occurred next. All I can remember is an air of unbelievable dread settling down over me like a weighted blanket, suffocating me. I tried to move my limbs, but found I couldn't. The skittering noise came again, over and over again in my brain. A voice kept shrieking, "Do not move." My eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for some sort of logic to this madness. There's no way this is sleep paralysis. It had settled in way too fast. That's when I realized it wasn't sleep paralysis. This was what they meant when people say, paralyzed in terror. More skittering, and then a small, dark figure crept out of a shadow in the top corner of the room. It was small, but its limbs were gangly. Its hair was unkempt and unruly. The only feature I could clearly make of it was the reflection of the red exit light in its eyes as they locked onto mine. Slowly, creakily, it crawled down the wall like a spider towards the ground. My lungs refused to take in any oxygen as its twiggy limbs jerked and cracked as it crawled towards me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized it was crawling towards me, upside down. It crumpled in on itself as it came closer, the skittering noises coming from its now visibly gaping mouth. I wanted to scream, run, anything, but I was frozen in place, shivering and sobbing silently as it came to hover over me. Its forehead grazed my own as its white pupilless eyes bore into mine, creaking and popping. It began to stand, contorting around itself as it stood up to tower over me. Looking up at it, it looked almost like a normal 6-year-old girl. The thing suddenly began to heave, as though it were laughing hysterically, although no sound came from the gaping hole in its face. Every so often, its neck would crack as it craned from side to side. It wriggled its gangly fingers, snapping with each jerky movement. Then, it took in a long, deep, creaky breath. It was a sound I had never heard and would never hear again. I'm not sure when I blacked out. I awoke surrounded by paramedics and panicked camp administrators. My junior counselor recounted to me later that I was lying on my back on the floor, my mouth agape in a soundless shriek, and my eyes rolled back so far that they appeared glassy and white. Upon her trying to shake me awake, I fell into a violent seizure. Seeing as it was my first ever seizure, I was to be taken to the hospital despite my protests. The administrators assured me that my kids were fine and that I could come back once I was given the all clear by the doctors. I was carted past a group of concerned and curious campers, as they were all waiting outside to catch a peek of the action. I glanced over at them and gave them all an enthusiastic thumbs up, promising I was fine and would be back soon. One wild-haired child caught my eye. Molly. She watched me silently with a slack jaw, her mouth gaping too wide for her small face. Her eyes were pupilless and white. The girl's tiny shoulders slowly began to heave in pure silence as I was loaded into the ambulance. For a moment, it looked as though she were laughing.